hydrostatic checks and other avionic related items. So if we'd like to welcome Chad.
Thank you. How's everybody doing? I'm Chad. Some of you know me. I work next door at St. Cloud Aviation. A little bit about me. I've been over there for about 6 years. Been in the industry for about 20. Started out chasing sparks as a pretty little kid, playing with batteries and light bulbs on the kitchen table. And like most kids, you go one way or the other. I got a remote control car for Christmas when I was real little, and they left me alone in the living room while they ate breakfast, and when they came back, it was in 200 pieces. My mom had a heart attack. Once I put it back together and it worked, I think they were surprised, and I don't think I've ever stopped tinkering since then. I knew it was leading a little more down the electronic lines, and I do a lot of mechanical work too, but I try to keep that more as a hobby than a career. Really enjoyed music and electronics most of my life, and so that led me to be a car stereo kid right out of high school. I ran a 6-store chain in the Twin Cities, and successful business, and won some awards and built some real neat vehicles and show cars. And I realized after years of doing that no matter how good I wasn't going to make any money. A customer of mine at the time, we had a common vehicle, and he would stop in and talk shop, and he had just bought a Baron that was belly landed. And he was going to restore it up at Leaders, and I didn't know anything about aviation. I suppose at this time I was probably about 20. And he said, you should really look into it. It pays better than cars do. And so I was not that little kid that said, pain as it flew over. I had no interest in aviation. I said, okay, well, what's the deal? And he said, well, come up and check this out. He had bought a real nice older Baron that a young pilot had forgotten to turn on the alternator, and after flying with his girlfriend for a while trying to impress her, the radios went black and he panicked. He gave the old emergency gear crank a crank or two, and I think it needed 62 instead of 2, and brought it in on the belly, and so he picked up that and another fuselage and proceeded to make a beautiful airplane out of 2, and basically work on getting his A&P down at Leaders under their supervision. I came up just haphazardly. We were friends. I wanted to see his project, but I had no intent of really getting into airplanes. And like most of you here, the minute I walked in the door, it was all over. I was hooked. And about that time, we were discussing things, and I heard an airplane so loud and it rattled the hangar, and I thought that somebody was attacking us, literally. And so this is 20 years ago, and little Kurt Leader had a little mini Mustang, and he was out doing loops over the top of the hangar. And that airplane is not supposed to go inverted. And so we ran outside to see what it was. And Bob was standing there, and my friend looked at Bob and looked at Kurt and looked at Bob and looked at Kurt and said, I didn't think it could do that. And Bob just kind of nonchalantly goes, guess it can. Just went back to work. And that's when I knew that aviation was my kind of people. I also got into it because I thought it was high tech, and I figured I was too old for the military and NASA at that point in my life, so where else can I find cool stuff that I get to play with expensive toys other than aviation? And then, so I figured I better get my foot in the door, so I went to A&P school down in the Twin Cities at Flying Cloud. Our instruction was all in the air traffic control building over there. And I walked in the door to air-cooled, carbureted magnetos, and I just about had a heart attack. But then I realized that quickly that if I got into the electronic side, which is where I intended to go all along, that there was some pretty neat stuff out there. And I literally went from knowing nothing to just being hooked right away. Made it through school and found out after I graduated that my background in automotive was much, much more beneficial to avionics than my A&P ever could have been. The A&P school was still teaching ADF and a lot of things that I wasn't really going to get into. But it was a great background. I'm glad I did it. It's certainly been helpful in the meantime, especially with FAA regulation and whatnot in my current career. I walked in the door as a totally green technician down at Flying Cloud, And they said, well, you've worked on audio, video before. Go play with those glass screens and those brand new airplanes over there. So they didn't know anything about Garmin glass or any of the rest of it, and they threw the new guy at it as, probably a kind of a scapegoat. But I thought, what better way to become the guru than to learn something that no one wants to learn, and that kind of kick-started my career. And I spent about a half decade down there and became the manager of that shop and ran it really successfully until the economy dropped out. About a year went by after everybody else slowed down, and we were still humming along. And I thought, well, aviation has some wealthy people in it. Maybe we're kind of immune to this little economic turndown. Well, that was a total misnomer, because about a month later, it was like somebody locked the front door and was dead in the door, So I had to get out of aviation with a lot of other people. We were let go and laid off, and I spent about 5 years back trying to make every dollar I could in automotive. And Mr. Maven Camp, my boss next door here, found my resume online. I wasn't thinking aviation had recovered enough. And he invited me to come up for an interview. I lived over in the Forest Lake area, so told my wife, I might as well see if I can maybe get my foot in the door, but there's no way in hell I'm ever going to stay at St. Cloud. That's a really long drive. 6 years later, here I am. I come into the most incredible group of guys. There's a couple technicians that have been lifers at St. Cloud that you couldn't ask for better guys. They literally are not only incredibly talented technicians, but probably the least amount of drama or any other issues that an employer would. I mean, they're literally perfect. They're great guys. They care, they show up, they work hard, they put in extra hours, and they do impeccable work. And basically, Bill told me that they were a guy short, that the technicians were having to double as the kind of the sales and management side, and they weren't getting anything done. So he invited me to come on board and try to get us out of the hole. They were thinking about shutting down the radio shop. The mechanics were steady busy, but the radio side was a little slow. I accepted the challenge, and I found that the team was perfect. All I needed to do was talk, which is kind of the gift of gab that I've been given. So ever since then, the first couple of months, I walked in and the hangars were empty. And I thought, well, how in the heck do I sell anything if there's no one to sell anything to? And I guess I got a little bit blessed or lucky that a few of my old customers from Flying Cloud had come up, and a few of the local people had stopped in, and between it all, we sold a few radios, and things got particularly busy. After about 6 months of that, we probably were booked out 6 to 8 months for an appointment for the last 5-6 years, so it's been amazing. The industry has changed a lot since I first started. When I first started, we were installing a few of the Garmin 430s and that, but it was basically just maintaining the existing equipment, whether that was an old King Navcom, or whatever the case was, transponders. There was a lot of bench repair that was going on. That's changed considerably. So the new age of avionics has changed already twice since I've been just at St. Cloud. The first kind of round was the fact that the manufacturers were starting to pull a lot of the capabilities to do repairs out of the repair stations. They were pulling that all in-house. So now if you had an old Bendix King radio and you wanted it repaired, you no longer could ask one of my guys to take a look at it for a couple $100. It was going to go to King for thousands. And that kind of killed a big part of our industry for a little bit. We used to call it trickle-down avionics. Your wealthy buddy would buy a fancy new radio, and his one that was only about 5 years old was going to look pretty attractive to you, and you could buy that used and bring it into the shop and have us install it. And we got both airplanes in the shop and both people taken care of. When that happened, a lot of the parts were becoming obsolete, or some of them were becoming hazardous where they were illegal to sell. And now all of a sudden we lost a lot of our used good avionics. In fact, I've put in more radios in the last few years that are older than I am than I have stuff from the 80s and 90s that used to be real popular as a backup or a second radio or a hand-me-down. And so that was a little bit a heartache at first, and then we found ways around it. We found that we could still get some parts, we could still get the FAA on our side to bless us to use parts that we could source from other vendors. So if you had a transponder from Bendix King that all of a sudden quit working, We used to buy that little chip from Bendix King for $10, sell it to you for $15 so we could keep our lights on and everybody was happy. Well, it was really a 50-cent chip. But when you're not a Bendix King dealer, they charge you like $75. And so the general public pretty much is ixnayed right out of there. The FAA basically said that as long as we can match the part exactly to the letter of the law, the part number and everything, we don't have to buy it from Bendix King. And so that was really, really helpful at keeping a lot of this old gear going. Because a lot of it's great stuff. You know, if it works, it works. There's no reason to replace it unless you're trying to add capabilities. The second phase has been a little bit of what got us into a lot of the experimental equipment. There's a rumor going around that a few years ago somebody accused the FAA of hindering safety by taking too long to get a lot of this new equipment approved for the approved aircraft side. And when you accuse the government of not doing their job, they get very, very worried, and they have to make a decision. They either fix the problem, make it go away, and make the rumors die down before it's a big deal, or they get basically overtaken by another department, and all of a sudden the DOT becomes the new FAA or something to that effect. So they basically said, okay, we're going to rewrite this part of our FARs, Part 27, and we're going to make it so that we can get these parts approved quicker and easier, and still safe, because that's our job. And we don't want to be known for hindering safety. If it's going to take us too many years to check out this new Garmin GPS or King radio and put an approval on it, then we need to find a way to do this more efficiently. And they turned to the experimental market and they said, well, here, look at, we've been putting these little indicators like Garmin G5s and autopilots in all kinds of RVs and other experimentals for years. We've got track record after track record of great quality, very low failures, millions of hours in the field. And the FAA was able to use that as part of the approval process to really cut down all the red tape. It did a couple things. It made it come to market faster, and it also cut the cost down, which is great for all of us. They also added a little snippet onto that called the NORC, which is basically talks about non-standard safety equipment. So people are putting in like carbon dioxide monitor or carbon monoxide monitors, USB charging ports, things that normally would be $500 if they had to go through the full FAA process. We're now going to only be maybe $100 or $200 through this new program, and that really kind of gave us a boost right when we needed it. In between that process, we had this whole ADS-B mandate. There's a lot of unknowns. Everybody knows that they, if they're going to go in any Class B, C, and E above 10,000, they've got to have an ADS-B out device. That kept us busy for quite a while. Everybody had said, okay, I know nothing about it, tell me about it, or I've done a little research, what should I do? And we basically came to the fact that there's a couple of different solutions for each one of those customers, and everybody is going to need a different box depending on either what they have in the airplane now, or maybe even what they plan on putting in the airplane in a couple of years. And that transformed into a lot of people putting a lot more money into the airplane than I ever thought. It was wonderful for business. And I get to be an advocate. I sell cool toys. So unlike the greasy used car salesman that talks you into something you don't want, most people came to me looking for something, and they're just looking for some advice on what plays well together or what talks well together. And so when the ADS-B came about, everybody's looking to do this for one of two reasons. They're either excited because they want a bunch of capabilities, or they're pissed off at the FAA and they just want to get this dang thing taken care of and out of the way. And there was a lot of people that thought if we wait till the end, it'll get cheaper, which of course in retail it never does. There were a few newcomers into the industry, and we basically put in a lot of devices that were either a portable device like a little wingtip or tail light from Avionics. We put in a lot of transponders. Garmin obviously is still the 800-pound gorilla for pretty good reason. They build a piece of equipment for every part of the industry, and it all really talks well together. There's a lot of other good manufacturers that make avionics, but they traditionally like to make one product that they specifically focus on. One of the big common ones for us was a transponder from Apario. everybody thought they were a new company in aviation, but really they have been doing a lot of ag stuff and big airplane stuff for years. But they were kind of new to general aviation. So we were putting in transponders to meet this mandate. And it was a great little box that you could hook up to one of their portables, and you could even use it with your iPad to see the traffic and weather and everything for free with an app like ForeFlight or such. So if we didn't do just an out like a tail light, we were maybe putting in a transponder. It would be my job to tell people that, you know, if we're going to do one of these, it's a brand new radio. We want to make sure that the circuit breaker and the fuses and the wiring, everything that goes with this, the antenna is either new or it's, you know, acceptable used where it's going to work great for years. And a lot of those were put in with panels that all the rest of the radios were good. They didn't need a brand new Garmin GPS. They were happy with their existing radios. They just wanted to get the mandate met and a little bit of info with this traffic and weather they heard all about on their iPad. So they were a common transponder, and then the other two solutions we did a lot of were a little bit more full-blown transponders from either the L3 Lynx, which had a screen right on the transponder, almost like a touch screen like a phone, and then Garmin had their version which would connect to their existing radios. So basically, if anybody had a WAS radio in the airplane, a GPS already, we would look at one of the higher end transponders, otherwise we'd look at one of the middle line entry ones. It seemed like everybody was coming in talking about that, but the next question out of their mouth is, well, what if I want to put in a radio with it? And, you know, my intercom is crackly and stinks, and what if I want to put an intercom too? And it transformed into putting in a lot of radio stacks in the last 5 years. That was the majority of our business. And we kept getting asked by a lot of customers, so do you think it's going to be dead when all this is over? Everybody's going to get the mandate met, or maybe they're not interested because they don't fly in that area and they're just not going to do it. What are you going to do after that? And that pretty much, besides our repairs and our daily work of keeping everybody on the field up and running and working, you know, we knew there was always going to be new products coming, but we really didn't know where it was going to go. At this time, we were starting to see a lot of the repairs I was talking about skyrocket. People were coming in with Bendix King radios where the display was starting to black out, and it would maybe work fine during the day, but as the daylight would come down, the display would flake out. And we used to repair them for a couple $100, and now you had to send it in for a couple $1,000, and that was going to be a problem. Nobody wanted to, and rightfully so, nobody wanted to put $2,000 into a radio that was built in the 70s, and then have no guarantee that with this fancy new display that the rest of the radio wasn't going to crap out in a few months. And so that started an issue where we were looking into trying to figure out what are we going to do for people that don't want to dump tens of thousands of dollars in the panel, but they need a new radio. And right about that time, there was a company that came out and said, you know, I was at a presentation, go to a couple Avionics conventions a year to try to stay up on all this stuff, and they basically said, we've got some new radios coming, and they do this, this, and this, and they're awesome, and we've got an FAA approval, and we're going to have the STC all ready to go in a couple months, and you'll be able to buy one, you know, put your orders in today and get on the list. And about 20 minutes later, the Garmin guy gets up and says, well, we've got one of those too, and it does everything the same, but it also does this, this, and this with our boxes. And they're in stock, and you can order them right when I get off stage. And they'll be at your door tomorrow. And that's what they do. Everybody loves to hate them because they are the 800-pound gorilla, and we worry a lot about monopoly and if they're overpriced. But I have to admit, in the years that I've been in it, they are their own best competition. They drive their own innovation and their own pricing to make sure that anytime anybody else even tries, they snuff out the little guy. I would gladly welcome more competition just for more options, but you never can go wrong with their product because of the way it integrates real well with each other. The other company that we've done a little bit with is Dynon. They kind of worked in the same magic of this Part 27 rewrite. They worked great for a lot of the experimentals, and then they started getting STCs for certified airplanes, which over at the shop is, you know, probably about 90% of what we do is on the certified end. But now there's such a blurred line between the two that I get to be kind of a guru for both. We tried to get a little more into the Dynon products so that we had some good options with Garmin, and I think they build an incredible product, but so far they've kind of made one crippling mistake, which was they built an all-in-one system where the autopilot and everything is all built into a package. If anybody knows anything about the FAA, is that they are deathly afraid of autopilots. If I tell them that I have a blue toggle switch and I want to change it to red, they say, okay, fine. And then I say, but it's for the autopilot. Oh no, you can't do that. And no matter what, literally it's like kryptonite. They haven't allowed any even minuscule minor modifications to autopilots since the 80s, which has been really tough. Because a lot of these airplanes, I installed one a few months ago in an RV-10 and it was phenomenal. And I want to go put that same autopilot in a, say it's a 185. And Garmin now has it approved. Great, let's put it in. Dynon is working on the 172 and they got that done, but they haven't gone to the other Cessna yet, so we're limited to Garmin. We open up the wing and there's a Robertson Stoll kit, and that servo is not going to fit there anymore. And I call the FAA and say, we just need to move it over an inch. And they say, have a nice plane without an autopilot. Yeah. And that's their answer. There is no wiggle room no matter what. Engineering doesn't matter. It would have to be redone by the factory. So we're still working on that. We're hoping that they will realize how well the rule changes have worked for the radios, that maybe that'll trickle down a little bit into the autopilots. I have a feeling that the lawyers have as much to do with that as anybody, of course. But, so that's kind of what we've been doing, putting in a lot of miniature glass screens like the G5s, some of the bigger ones like the G3X Touches. They basically replace the entire 8-pack of steam gauges. Garmin was nice enough to not only approve the equipment that was in the experimentals, but they also approved all the neat features that you normally couldn't get in the certified world with Garmin's bigger equipment. If you wanted to put in a large 10-inch glass screen in an airplane, a number of years ago, I mean, you couldn't touch it for under $30,000. And now, a 10-inch screen is maybe $9,000. So it's not free, but it's certainly trending in the right direction. One of the big differences was when they got all that approved, they also did engine monitors. That was something that we've been tinkering with JPI and Electronics International for years. The FAA says that because it bolts on the engine, you have to have an A&P to sign it off. But I don't know that many A&Ps that do wiring quite as well as the spark chasers. So we usually get involved and run all the harnesses and route everything, and then because I've got an A&P on top of being in the radio shop, I'm able to do the paperwork. So they're done nice and clean and neat and work well. They had two variations that were pretty common that we would install. One was just basically for redundant information. You wanted to see maybe exhaust temp and cylinder head temp and maybe even some of the other temps, or maybe even oil pressure, fuel flow. And you could put in a unit and it worked well. But if you wanted to take out all the factory gauges, you had to buy the higher end model that was twice the price, and then it would actually replace everything. There was a few benefits to that because you could take out the steam gauges that had all the liquid lines running under the panel. Most people don't think it's a big deal because they've never had problems with them. When I was at the car stereo shop, I put a brand new radio in a 77 Corvette, and I forgot to hook up the oil line to the back of the oil gauge. And when he got home and his carpet was full of oil, he wasn't very happy with me. Same thing can happen in the airplanes. They can sprout leaks or they can come loose. And so a lot of the new systems will have sensors that go out of the engine, a lot like all the cars out in the parking lot, and then just wires coming through the firewall. A lot more accurate, a lot more reliable, but also more expensive. And Garmin's idea of this whole bring the experimental stuff into the certified world, they also brought their engine monitor along with the glass screens and the autopilots. So now we've got an engine monitor that's capable of displaying high-tech accurate info, and it's about half the price that the competition was. The competition built a good product, but they had kind of poor customer support, and they never were really involved in the community. They were never at any of the shows looking for feedback and that. And that's one thing that I've had pretty good luck with most of my avionics manufacturers. If we've got a legitimate complaint, you can see something in the works, if not a software update, usually within 6 months, including getting the FAA to sign off on it. You're not going to get that from Sony at Best Buy or anything, but in the aviation world, I think they realize that safety being paramount, they take this stuff pretty seriously. So that's a little bit about what we've been doing in the shop. It's kind of transitioned from, outfitting everything from something like a basic intercom to, you would not believe how many times recently that I've put much more money in the panel than the airplane is worth. Some of them that stand out, recently we did 30-some thousand in a 150 Charlie. Beautiful panel and built for instruction. And we got a gentleman that just finished up a 182 that was over 6 figures, and I cut the dash on my Chevelle and put in a CD player because it'll ruin the car, ruin the value. Should I do the same thing to my airplane? Should I put $30,000 worth of avionics in a $75,000 airplane? Am I ever going to get that back? And for a lot of time, for many years, I was basically encouraged to talk about the resale on avionics. It was the kitchens and bathrooms of the remodel, was what I've been told. And I knew that there was some merit to that, but I was also reminded that the labor side, because it does have to be done on the certified planes by someone that's legally capable of doing it, the labor goes out the window right away. It's gone to money heaven. The product, on the other hand, seemed to hold its value pretty well. And one example of that would be the old Garmin GPSs, the 430s and 530s, including the lost versions. They are still to this day getting 90% of the value of what we sold them for brand new 25 years ago. You don't see that much with most other upgrades. So it was fun to see that was a big benefit to people. If you put the money in, you're going to get some back out of it, but you're also going to lose obviously the install and the depreciation. In the meantime, with all the new stuff that's come out and how much less it's cost, we've been able to do some pretty extensive upgrades to panels that give the airplanes a lot more capabilities. There's been some Skyhawks and Cherokees and stuff coming out of our shop that you would have no problems flying hard IFR in, and that just wasn't the case 5-10 years ago. People didn't buy that stuff unless they did it all the time. Now they can get into a really good autopilot that'll shoot an approach in their Cherokee 140 that, now the autopilot was 10-15,000, and it used to be triple that for anything comparable. And so the safety factor, the toy factor, the information overload, it's come full circle with our smartphones and everything. We're finally getting that into the avionics side of it. The upside to the radio shop that we have is being a repair station. We're allowed to do the pedostatic checks and transponder checks. It's a little bit of a gray area. Most people don't know all what's involved, and it's been done differently by many shops through many years. The FARs are very, very, very gray. Basically, I'm sure it doesn't surprise you, but the government doesn't want to take responsibility for telling you what you can do. They'll only tell you what you can't do. And so what they basically recommend is that we test this equipment to a certain standard, and then they'll tell you things. I'll give you an example. Test the altitude encoder at a reasonable number of points. Reasonable. That sounds like a word that you're going to, nail me into my coffin no matter what my answer is, right? So what we've done is some shops have given up just doing a basic transponder check. That used to be pretty common. If somebody was only going to fly VFR, we're going to get into the shop, we're going to run the transponder encoder through a gamut of tests, and if it passes, if it's putting out the right squawk code and the right altitude, and it looks good on the ground, we're good to go. People would say, well, it took you 15 minutes, but it was a $100 check. And then I would give them the whole automotive technician spiel about the $25,000 box that I had to buy to be able to test that. It no longer is the $1,500 box. Once ADSB came along, they rewrote all the rules on what needed to be tested. The odd part is that because Big Brother is watching you and they literally know everything about you with ADSB, we put in the exact dimensions of the airplane, the speeds, the stall speeds, the tail number, everything about the plane. And they, of course, being that it's hooked up to a WASP GPS, they know your exact move, every move, unless you pull the breaker. At that point, they want us to test it all when we install it, but they don't require any additional testing for ADSB once it's installed. And I have to think that has a lot to do with the fact that they're watching all the time. So if you have a hiccup in your equipment, they're probably going to send you a nasty gram, and you're going to know in the mail before I ever would. Otherwise, we still do the check every couple of years, and we check basically the same stuff we have for years. the squawk code to make sure that all the numbers and dials are working, and that the transmitter is putting out a good amount of power, and that it's on the right frequency, not wandering all over the place like an old radio. And then basically it's connecting to the altitude encoder so that that's accurate. I check them on the ground, my crew does, and we're willing to sign that off. There's a few shops in the area that have told me that they're no longer going to do that because they don't think that's a reasonable number of points, like I mentioned earlier. To do anything else, you've got to hook up an entire test set to the airplane on the pitot and static lines, and you basically use a test box to simulate the airplane going up in altitude. Well, when you get into that, you open a can of worms, because now the system has to be sealed. If it has too big of leaks, my box won't overcome the leak, and it's not going to pressurize, or it's vacuum actually, to raise it in altitude. So if you have any leaks, now we've got to fix leaks before we can continue. It's required, it's important if you're flying IFR, but I personally don't think it is for VFR. Most of us that are flying VFR, you know, if we're 5,000 to 6,000, we're getting up in the nosebleed area, and anything below that, the altimeter is usually pretty darn close. When we do the IFR check, it takes probably about triple the amount of time. And people would say, well, if you check the encoder at that reasonable number of points, you've basically done a full IFR check. Why don't you just do only IFR checks? Well, for the guy that put 3 hours on his airplane last year, he's really not looking forward to that hefty bill to do an IFR check when he only flies VFR. And so that's been my reasoning behind it, and the FAA has been in agreement with me so far, so it's been working out pretty well.
Hey Chad, what are the parameters of the IFR certification? It includes, of course, the transponder check, and so you've got a sealed system, and you take it to different altitudes and
Correct.
all that reporting. What else is involved in that? And then what's the average total cost of it? Because that's a, is that an annual or biannual?
Biannual.
Yeah, it's
Yep.
24 months.
Yep.
So every 24 months, if I have an IFR certified aircraft, what do I get to look forward to?
So with IFR, you basically take the what we would have called the VFR check, which is the transponder and the encoder, and because we're going to hook up our test equipment to the pitot and static lines, we're going to make sure that they are basically sealed. The FAA has limitations on the amount of leak. There can be a little leak, so we don't have to spend all day trying to get every fitting perfect, but it's pretty minimal. Usually they'll allow it to leak about 100 feet a minute. So if I go ahead and crank it up, and you know, most altimeters and most certified airplanes that are not pressurized usually have a 20,000 foot ceiling. Well, we know darn well we're not taking most of our aircraft up there, but the equipment was certified to that level, which means it has to be tested to that level. I'm willing to fudge in the gray areas. I never break rules, but I will bend them if I think it's appropriate safety-wise. If I get an airplane that has a heck of a leak up there, but at 18 it seals up and it's doing pretty well, you know, we might let that go depending on the plane. So we first of all make sure the system's working. You've got to do some basic checks to make sure that your equipment is tied in and it's appropriate, doesn't have any leaks, and then you basically run the altimeter down to 1,000 feet below sea level, and then all the way up to the working limit of the instrument, which is in most airplanes is 20,000. So that takes a few hours to do. When the equipment is all hooked up in the plane, most of them have a VSI, and so I can only go as fast as the VSI will allow, otherwise it'd be bending the needles on a lot of your instruments. A lot of planes, that's a 2,000 foot VSI. So we'll run it up in altitude, and basically we've got a check that's right in the FARs that says, okay, you need to check it at this altitude, and at each one they'll give you such a range. So down on the ground, your altimeter might only be able to be about 20 feet out of tolerance either direction. And if it is, we can issue a little correction card, but you don't actually have to get that repaired. If it reads 20 feet low at 3,000 and 20 feet high at 5,000, that's fine. As it gets higher, the tolerance gets bigger.
The card becomes a placard?
Yeah, and it's something we put in the log, so you don't have to keep it in the airplane because it did pass close enough to be within spec. We also check basically that the altitude encoder, which is hooked up to that transponder, is within 100 feet of that altimeter too. So that way you not only are looking at with your own eyes at the correct altitude, but that the tower is seeing the correct altitude. A lot of the modern digital transponders that have come out even 20 years ago, and even the ADS-B ones now, a lot of times they'll even have on the display the uncorrected altitude. And you turn your altimeter to 2992 and you have a little display on there, you know, they should match within 100 feet there. Once they're all pumped up and down and it passes the check, usually we can get that done in about 3 hours. So your standard VFR check being about $100, the IFR check is usually closer to, we do them for $295. The more equipment you have, the more expensive it gets. We have a lot of people that decide to put another altimeter on the co-pilot side. Some of the bigger twins that we see, even the piston airplanes, might have 2 transponders or 2 altimeters, sometimes 3. And so whatever equipment is in the airplane technically is supposed to pass.
Including the RNAV stuff.
Yep. The way that the radios work in is that the pitot-static stuff is all pneumatic, and that's all completely standalone. So it has nothing to do with the vacuum system and your gyros and the DG and Horizon and that. That's a common misconception that they're integrated, but it's completely separate. And again, as far as the navigation side goes, and checking your right, left needles and everything, that's all a complete separate check that doesn't actually have any FAA requirement as far as us checking it on any type of annual schedule. We do it quite often just for just for customer service sake, and obviously if anybody comes in and says that they have a squawk on it, they noticed it was off, whatever the case is. But as far as the pitot-static check, it's literally just the altimeter. Our equipment is hooked up to the pitot side, so you'd think we'd check the airspeed. My guys usually will, just to see where it's at, because if it's way off, we'd like to inform you about it, but there's no legal requirement to check any of the other pneumatic instruments, the VSI, the airspeed, just the altimeter itself. So, and the big addition with some of the electronic instruments like the G5s and G3X and some of the Dynons, a lot of them will have an altimeter and an airspeed inside the little Horizon display. They're not legal for certified airplanes, they're more of a toy. The Horizon is the legal instrument, but they are probably more accurate than the instruments that are there alongside them. And I know a lot of pilots that'll look at that versus the steam gauge one. But as far as the FAA is concerned, the steam gauges are the primary ones. So the pitot-static checks, like Bill mentioned, are every 2 years. As far as up here in St. Cloud, of course, because we're not in that class airspace like down in the Vale, you're not required to have a transponder at all. A lot of people would say, okay, my transponder died. What are the provisions there? Basically, anywhere that you used to have a transponder, you now have to have an ADS-B out device. All of the newer transponders have that built in. The ones that you bolt on the wingtip or on the tail, they're listing to people's old crank knob transponders quite often. And so those have got to be tuned up. I do a lot of repairs on those when somebody brought it in and they said, I bought one of those tail beacons, my A&P put it on, and I can't figure out why it doesn't work. And it usually has nothing to do with the installation. If you call the company, they'll make sure that you spliced into the nav light wires correctly and you didn't use a backyard electrical hack with some wire nuts or something, but that you did it properly. But for the most part, they're basically looking for it to work. Turn on the light comes on, it must be working. What they didn't know is there's a little note in the instruction manual that says you have to check transponder first. And a lot of people, because they're not in an area that required a transponder, they didn't know that their transponder was a little out of spec. So now you're garbage in, garbage out. Your transponder wasn't quite right, and now your new ADS-B device is telling the tower that you're somebody that you're not, or you're going somewhere that you're not, or wrong altitude, or whatever it may be. So we tune a lot of those up and do a lot of paperwork. There's the old joke in aviation that the airplane doesn't fly. What is it until the paperwork weighs as much as the airplane? The way they're set up, there's a lot of truth to that. I pretty much make the paperwork my other main job, so my guys can stay turning wrenches where they prefer to be. But even on something like a tail light like that, it takes 10 minutes to put on, but it requires updates to the flight manual, the instructions for continued airworthiness for the mechanic that does the annuals, and then also the FAA wants to see a 337 form for the STC. So there might be 2 or 3 hours of paperwork to install a 10-minute device. I mean, it's literally the same crap that we're used
Chad,
to.
I've got an obscure question,
Yeah.
but maybe not so obscure. When you have the aircraft logs for these aircraft, the airframe and engine logs, that's the value of that airplane. how do you handle and store those logs while you have the airplane?
Well, I've got them at my shop. I keep them on a shelf locked up in my office.
The log shelf.
I can't say I've ever lost any. There's certainly always that possibility, and that would be a very, very terrible day for a lot of people, including myself. But generally, I only need the airframe. There isn't much that we do in the radio shop that requires anything with the engine or propeller. And I know my counterpart, Ron, our maintenance manager, has the same deal. He's got his own office with a lockable door, and we keep them in there. They never go out in the hangar. When we do all of our research, even for the annuals, which I try to actively help participate in the maintenance department. You know, we're a small company, and we all kind of try to help take care of each other. And you'll probably realize that there's sometimes some labor overlap in doing an annual while you've got the whole thing torn down for a month or two for some radios. You know, we've got interior out and panels out, and so a lot of times we might have a customer that's never had us do their annual, and they just decide it'd be good to have a kind of a fresh set of eyes. You know, my buddy's been helping me do the annual for 10 years. Why don't you guys do it this year? It's usually not cheaper. My guys are pretty good and thorough, and they find some pretty exciting stuff. We just had a twin Cessna in the other day that we had to take the tail off because it was loose. It was loose. The bolt holes were oblonged out, and the brackets and stuff and the bolts need to be replaced. And it was missed, I can imagine, multiple years. It wasn't going to fall off tomorrow, but it was way, way, way out of spec and would have eventually been very dangerous. So it's a lot of fun working with guys that truly have a passion for it. They're all paid by the hour, for better, for worse. You know, the vast majority of people will agree that avionics and maintenance in general, airplanes are expensive. And a lot of people think that there's a substantial amount of markup or time involved, just like taking your car to a dealer instead of your buddy next door. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. We don't have book time in avionics, and we traditionally give away a fair amount of labor to be competitive. I don't know why the industry has gone that way, but everybody is cutting each other's throats, so I try to do the same to remain competitive. So I would say on an average, if you had a radio installation and you brought in used or new, it wouldn't matter. The labor is the same. We don't charge people more when they bring us in used equipment. I test it, make sure it works, and we put it in. And let's say for instance, a Garmin 430. You know, it might take about 30 hours to install, start to finish. It's probably going to take my guys, who I would admit are pretty quick, probably 35. You know, I'm going to bid out the job, and just like your average carpenter, if they do it right, you know, they're going to be close, but if they go over, it's their own fault for not bidding it. I'm the same way. When I started, there was quite a few customers that came in and said that you guys have a reputation for doing good work, but you're really slow and you're always way over budget. And you know, I made it kind of my personal goal to fix that. I have made sure that we always stick to every quote to the nails. And it doesn't mean that people don't come in and add stuff as we have it apart. Well, you got this apart. Can you look at that? Or can you maybe put in a charger for my phone or my iPad, or you know, something outside of the original scope. But
how many years ago did you institute this new approach to address that?
Oh, David, no.
Was it?
6. I think it's about
It was
6
good
years.
6 years ago.
Yeah. So
Alright.
before that, I know it's the same crew, and I know they were being fair, but I think they were underbidding quite often, and you know, and I don't think it was malicious at all. I think they literally just, you know, their eyes were bigger than their stomach type theory. And so I tried to take my previous experience down at Flying Cloud, which it was a different clientele. You know, when I came up here, I had been primarily spoiled with all brand new airplanes down there. That was mainly because the shop that I was working for was a dealer for all the major name brands. And so I got to take a lot of wealthy clients that just spent, you know, $500,000 on a new plane, and they didn't even know how to fly at all. And they went through the entire process of getting their license, storing the airplane with us. The avionics were already new, so I had to teach them how to use it and how to do all their updates to remain current, both in software and on the database side. You know, the databases to fly IFR can be done by a pilot, but most pilots I know are not IT guys, and they don't really want to learn how to run an entire computer setup just to do monthly updates. So I would set up a program and do those for a lot of clients. When I came up to St. Cloud, you know, the newest airplane I worked on for the first couple of years was probably built in the 70s. There was no shiny new stuff, and if you saw a restart Cessna that was 20 years old, that was considered a brand new Ferrari at that point. So I grew up working on hot rods and muscle cars with my dad. He was the mechanical side, and of course, as you know, I've taken the electrical side. So I have a real personal interest in making a lot of these old birds look new. You know, there's no salt on the runways. Pretty much if you take care of them, they last forever. So, you know, what's the difference if I put brand new radios in a 68 172 or in an 88 172? You know, it doesn't matter to me. And because of what we do, a lot of the equipment that we're changing out, a lot of times we got the panel all apart. A lot of times it makes sense to pull the old broken plastic out, maybe the old rocker switches and circuit breakers that are all, the labels are worn off and things look nasty. And we've got a couple local shops in town we work with that we draw everything up and they laser cut out some aluminum and we powder coat it or paint it wherever you like and label it up real nice, and it looks like a brand new airplane at that point. And so that's been some capabilities that I was able to bring to the shop through my automotive experience. We have a process that we've done a couple times called hydro dipping, if anyone's ever heard of that. They basically take a film, kind of looks like transparency. They lay it in a tub of water and they'll take your panel and dip it into it, and it'll transfer the print right onto the color. So you spray like a base color down and dip it in. You can do wood grain, carbon fiber, you can do any type of print, you can do hearts, you can do whatever you want. And so people did some custom decoration, and it all started because I had a guy that wanted me to do a wooden overlay. And I just told him, I said, you can do it when I'm done, but I legally can't do that because it's not fireproof. The FAA won't let me. So we were able to paint it up, and away we went, and it worked out real well. Obviously, it's a lot more common to do black and tan and gray and just some of the basics that go real well with the interiors. But we can make anything old, you know, look brand new, besides all the fancy screens and dials and gauges. I'm a perfectionist in that way, so that's both a blessing and a curse. I like to throw in a few little tidbits when we've got it apart. Well, anything that we see in there, we're going to fix. I don't really care who's paying for it if it's a safety issue. I'm going to present it to you, and if you feel like it's fair and you want to chip in and help out, that's great. But if I wouldn't put my kids in it, it's not rolling out of the door. It's aviation, you know, you can't just pull over. It's not worth any issues. You would not believe how many radio shops we have that we've seen their installs come in, and they did a great job on the radio that was installed. It was clean, it was neat, it works properly, and they literally took all the old wires and cut the connectors off and left them. And there's 100 pounds of crap that could have been pulled out, and they didn't. And it's not that maybe if they would have talked to the customer and he would have declined the offer to do it, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But more often than not, I've been told that they were never asked, they were never given the opportunity. I'm one of those guys that researches things to death. Half the time, by the time I pick out what I want, it's probably discontinued. And so I'm the same way when it comes to airplanes. I do not want to find out from shop B that shop A put this in and it works great, but if they just would have told me that this was available, I would have bought that instead. So I always made it my kind of personal mission to exclude my own tastes and budget out, show you guys all what's available, and kind of give you a good, better, best scenario and find out what's going to work well, and then make sure that you're not overspending or not underspending. Sometimes people will stretch their budget now because they know that they're making a decision that's going to save them a bunch in a few years.
So Chad, these ancillary issues that you get when you open up a instrument panel, your philosophy is to address everything and present all options.
Yeah, I'll if I have the time and the effort, I'll certainly try to take pictures even and get some emails or phone calls out. I might even call you down and say, come take a look at this.
And qualify what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Now, is it eminently less, well, you gotta say yes to this, but it would be eminently less expensive for the owner to address as many issues as you can once you open that panel up.
Absolutely. Most of the panels, if we're doing more than just one radio, a lot of times they're gutted pretty well. And with the introduction of some of these new instruments like the G5s and that, we're removing entire vacuum systems.
Right.
So by the time we pull the old harness out and all the old vacuum lines and regulators and filters, it's naked back there. And a lot of times the new harness can be routed, and if there's some old wires from a DME or an ADF or an old autopilot, they aren't hurting anything, when the guy cut them off and left them, but they're unnecessary, they're extra weight, and more importantly, they make it more difficult to troubleshoot anything down the road. When things are cleaned up and done right, it's going to make everybody's life easier in the future. And the majority of the time, it's not that time consuming. We don't run into complete disasters where we have to dig a lot further than we're already at very often. If we do, we'll cross the bridge when we get there, but it's not real common. So, but you wouldn't believe how many times I found wires wrapped around control columns, and I'm just waiting for somebody to say, well, I went up and I could only turn left. Some of it's been pretty scary. A lot of burnt wiring, a lot of butt connectors, and being a car guy, I can rip on the automotive industry because I do a lot of that. And some of the automotive jobs that I do for fun, I end up using aviation parts because I just know how superior they are. But you wouldn't believe how many times somebody has taken a landing light switch and replaced it with a toggle switch from Radio Shack, and then rather than put new wire on it, they butt spliced the old ones, and they crimped it with pliers, and it crimped down, and it just didn't make a good connection. And all the time it's been back there, it's been cooking, and by the time we pull it out, it's black and burnt. And it's something that if it happens on Highway 23 out here, I can probably jump out and call the fire department. But if it happens in flight, it gets a little exciting.
That's what emergency checklists are for.
That's right.
Checklist for that installation.
Where's that one?
So,
I mean, I'm gonna throw a plug in that you probably won't say, but if you guys are thinking about, upgrades or adding things, mixing old and new is kind of like that kitchen cabinet analogy of stripping the paint off half the doors and staining them, and staining over the paint on some of the others. It doesn't look right. Taking old and trying to splice it in with new, it doesn't work well long term. Spend the extra money and make it all new.
I would say the vast majority of the radio stacks that we've done, if we leave anything, it's usually maybe a number 2 radio that's in good shape, whether it's a comm or an AVCOM with the indicator, and somebody's putting all their entire budget into doing a new main radio, and they just don't quite have the cash to do all of it. I have no problem doing that, but you'll often see my guys, even though I didn't budget for it, they're not going to leave it wired the way it is. If we're going to do an audio panel and a transponder and a GPS, next thing you know, that Narco or King radio that was perfectly working fine is now ripped out, and it's all on the bench, all taped together in a nice stack, and all the wires are getting jumped together, like networked together on the bench. New wiring and clean, and so even with the old equipment, when I can save it, I will, but it'll probably get rewired even if I didn't quote it, even if it wasn't in the budget. And that couple of things that makes my installers' lives a little easier. They sleep better at night knowing it's done right. It's going to have less issues and problems in the end. One of the big things that we combat in avionics is noise. Airplanes are a terrible, terrible environment for noise. We're putting a bunch of very sensitive electronic receivers in with a bunch of horrible ignition and electrical systems. The manufacturers back then weren't up against things like this. We would have numerous times where somebody would come in and want a GPS installed, and we would put it in, and everything went great, and it was right on time and on budget, and we're going to go out and test it. And we test it, and the GPS works great. And as we're going through the final checklist to sign it off, we do an interference check on the comm radio, and we key up a frequency, and the GPS fails. All the satellites literally went from full strength to just gone, none.
Ooh.
And you wouldn't believe how many times that happens to a piece of equipment that really is working just fine. Whether it's an old King radio, could be an old ELT. That's another sore subject for a lot of people, is the FAA requires an ELT, but they don't monitor the old ones. Well, why the heck do you require it if you're not even listening for it, right? And now I just found out that I got to replace it because it interferes with my new Garmin radio. Then Chad didn't tell me it was going to do this. And we don't know literally until we power it up outside of the hangar so that it's not surrounded in a big metal box. And we go out and we key it up, and we find out that the old, American ELT is now causing the brand new Garmin radio to fail. At that point, you have a couple options. You can take it out for a few months legally for maintenance, but eventually you're going to need either a different one or a new one. the new ones have come down considerably in price. You know, you can get a good one that the SARSAT, all the Search and Rescue actually does monitor for probably about $600 for an ELT. The issue is that part of the new technology is that it has a switch up on the panel. So there's some labor involved. The last thing I want to do is call somebody at the end of a job and say that, hey, we need a $600 ELT and maybe, you know, $1,000 or $1,500 to put it in. And by the way, your old one works perfectly fine, it's just not compatible. It becomes a bigger issue when it's that old number 2 radio that I just told you that we like to keep. So we put in all these new audio panel and transponder and glass and everything works great. And you've got this old number 2 radio that you were only going to use for emergency backup, maybe for tuning in ATIS or a ground versus tower situation. And then I key it up and the dang thing fails miserably. Well, it's not Bendix King's fault or Narco's fault. The radio works great. It meets every spec it was ever intended to in 1967. The problem is that they didn't have GPS back then, and the new GPS is getting awfully irritated when it's in the same vicinity. So sometimes that stuff will pop up, and like Dave mentioned, at that point, you know, putting in a second new piece is going to tie into the rest of the glass, and it's going to basically create a heck of a lot less problems with any interference. But it's not free, and so I try my best to do things when I can do them a la carte, and I'll give you multiple situations and options and try to tie everything together the best I can to work with any budget, whatever that may be. So, any other questions about radios or checks? I'm trying to think of
Where are the
anything
ground
else.
stations for ADSB? Are they around here?
They're all over the place. Yes, good call. One thing I forgot to touch on. ADSB is one of those things that was forced upon us, but they don't tell us anything about. They're spread out all over the country. They're very sporadic when you get into the mountainous regions out west. But the downside is they're not at every airport yet. There's been some talk of maybe putting one on each one of the airports over a certain size, I would imagine. So the way ADSB works is you get up and you get flying, and once you get high enough where you can have a line of sight to that tower and your ADSB device are going to start talking back and forth. And all of the ADSB towers are connected underground, including with the radar towers. So once you're on the network, you know, nationwide, everybody knows where you are at that point. In St. Cloud, you got to be about 2,500 feet above the ground. So, you know, 3,500 feet before it really starts to get real good reception. And once you're on there, if you have one of the in devices, you can also, when I program the out devices, I actually tell the FAA what equipment you have on board. So if you've got an in device that receives the traffic and weather, they now know that, and they'll send a personalized packet of info up to your device. That way it can pinpoint you and the traffic and make sure that the traffic and weather are actually legit for your location and not just a random, you know, throw up of information. So down here on the ground, you're not going to get weather. You know, some of the bigger airplanes, a lot of guys had little portable Garmins for years that they had a subscription to XM so that they could get some of the weather products. Being satellite based, you could get it on the ground, but it was expensive. It was like a $75 a month subscription. The ADSB side is all completely free, with the exception that you've got to have an app to run it. Some apps are cheaper than others. Some are free, some are a little more spendy. Even the expensive ones are what, a couple $100 a year maybe. Most people that have got that info on the iPad will notice that the weather will start to come in and download, whether it's the NextRad or METARs, as soon as you get up to about that point. The downside to that is you've got to be up there. There is no type of repeater system. The traffic system is totally different. Traffic is, they must deem it a little bit more of a safety issue than the weather. The traffic works like a repeater system. So if you are on the ramp out here and Joe Blow is doing some flyover to going from here to, you know, Timbuktu, and he is up where he is getting the ground station signal, your device will get the traffic from his transponder right above you. You don't have to be up 3,000 feet in the air. And they do that a variety of ways. It comes from the tower, it comes from other airplanes. It can even come from the big TCAS stuff on board, like Delta flights and that. So depending on what you're watching it on, you'll notice if you have an iPad, because that's not certified and it's used more of an advisory or a toy, it'll show you everybody. You'll see Delta on there, you'll see one of our planes out on the ramp, you'll see everybody. When you get into the installed avionics, they want to filter out some of the garbage that means nothing to you, and so they'll just do the stuff that's more of an imminent threat. And it'll tell you who's around, and a lot of them are putting in some pretty expensive software that'll even do like a trending vector to tell you which way and the airplane is going, and if it's going up or down, the tail number, all that information right on the tablet or on the installed device like a Garmin radio. All of those, when they're installed versus a portable, a lot of them will do an audio call out too, so you can be sitting there and somebody is coming at you. If they're alongside you and they're never going to cross paths, the software will deem them not a threat automatically. But if they see they're going to come at you and they want to alert you of it, it changes the color and the shape of the design, and then also the audio panel will kick in and it'll give you a traffic alert. Back in the day when you had an expensive transponder, you could go down inside the Muncie Vale and the radar tower would give some of that information to some of the old Garmin equipment. But it would just yell at you, just traffic, traffic, and that was it. Nowadays, your existing equipment with the Garmin, like a GPS, will say, and over the speaker, over the headset, it'll say traffic 2 o'clock low, 4 miles. And so it's come a long way. And a lot of it's automated. A lot of it you turn on the master and you fly. You don't need to be a computer programmer to
Chad, when
figure
you
it
say
all out.
radios, you're talking about the integrated NavCom Garmin GPS style thing?
Correct, yeah, that's the most common. Some of the transponders have it built in, like for instance, like the Garmin and Apario ones will have the traffic built in where you don't need an actual GPS to display it. If you have one, it will talk to it and it'll show up on that screen. But a lot of them will just use like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth to a cell phone or an iPad. And so that's a lot less expensive way to go. If the airplane doesn't already have that fancy $10,000, $15,000 GPS, you can use a tablet and get most of the info. You're not going to get the audio coming out of there, but some of them, they will put the audio over the tablet. So a lot of guys, if they've got an intercom that's got a little music jack, they might plug their iPad right into that music jack and they could hear some of the call outs through there for traffic safety and that. So it's really come a long way. Like I mentioned earlier, we used to think that glass panels were for big airplanes, and now I put them in single engine piston airplanes all the time. So the safety, the awareness, the capabilities of the autopilots. We were just talking the other day about how they do a lot of vertical nav stuff where you can go in and assign an altitude to a waypoint now, and the new autopilots will literally fly like a faux glide slope between your waypoints. So you can almost create a glide slope to the glide slope and literally fly down and not only safety wise, but everything is doing what it's supposed to do. And one of the fun things with what I do is when we put in these new autopilots, guys actually realize it's a pretty big learning curve when you get the plane back and it's got new equipment in it. Yeah. And how common is it to get in there and want to play with the GPS, and just like when you're reaching behind you in the car and you go for the ditch. Guys do that in airplanes all the time. They're fumbling with the radios, and the first thing the instructor will say is, "Look out the dang window." You can't fly with your head down.
Been there, done that.
Yeah.
Anybody else know?
So I always, whenever we can, we'll try to arrange a ride with one of our instructors when people pick up the planes, and I don't charge for it just to go around the patch for an hour. It's just kind of part of the deal. Either the gentleman I work for, Bill, who's got, what is he up to, 47,000 hours, something like that, on just about every airplane you can think of. And any of our flight instructors know the equipment we put in really well, much better than I do. I have to admit, and Dave kicks me for this, but I've been so involved in my career in doing avionics that I've never made the time to get my license, and that's one of my goals. I've got small children, and they take all my extra time and money, but eventually I'd like to work on at least the basics, hopefully a private, and I don't know that I'd be instrument rated, but I certainly, being in what I do, the instrument rating would help explain a lot of the features. So right now I rely on a lot of my instructors and the other technicians that have their ratings that can explain some of the details, because some of this stuff has a 600-page manual, and you know what we all do with manuals. They're great paperweights.
So to repeat that, you have 2 pilots or techs that will go with the owner and just do hands-on
Certainly.
in operation,
Yep.
for 5-6 hours, or.
I wish I could do that long. Generally, if you're willing to,
I'll start high. You work it out.
Especially since it's usually in your airplane with your fuel. If you're willing to pay the instructor for the time, they'll do it anytime. They're always looking for extra work. But I usually try to at least go out and do kind of a final checkout. And you know, we actually work on an awful lot of airplanes that aren't based here. I did a presentation for the EAA chapter in Forest Lake last month. And there's that's a little airport that they've now paved the runway. They put up a couple dozen pretty good sized man cave hangars and is really up and coming. And there's quite a few experimental anti-fighter airplanes down there. And being my hometown, you know, skipping a jump, and I knew some of them from being customers up here. But I want to make sure that when the airplane is done and you jump in it and fly home, that you don't end up being on the news because you were playing with your radios and Chad didn't tell you how to work. So generally what will happen is we'll go up, we'll test fly it, and some of it's a requirement. If it's an autopilot, we're going to test fly it because the FAA says we're supposed to, and it's just a smart thing to do. I kind of like to do it anytime we can. Sometimes it doesn't always work. You know, somebody flew in from out of state and they just want to get home, and they're an IFR proficient pilot, and yeah, this stuff is new, but they'll tune the radios and they'll make it home and they'll play with it in their own time, and that's their choice. But if I can, I'd like to stick somebody in it for an hour and go around the patch a bunch, shoot some approaches, you know, play with the equipment, know how to turn it on, know how to get the basics down so you're comfortable.
With Garmin, of course, if there's a lot of Garmin stuff out, even the 530s, that buttonology is kind of the same as the newer upgraded.
Yeah, they've tried to keep a lot of it. Yep, they changed the almost everything's gone to touch screen, and that was a pretty sore subject when they first came out. You'll notice that all the competition likes to wait for Garmin to come out with a new box, and then they'll listen to the public's complaints and try to take those and capitalize on making a box that addresses those issues. So, for instance, Avionics builds great GPSs, and they decided we're going to make ours so that they'll just slide in to the tray of a 530 or 430. If you want to upgrade to one of the newer Garmin ones, you have to take the tray out and rewire it, and there's a fair amount of labor there. So we're going to build a box that meets that objection and beats it. And they build great radios, and they said, okay, well, everybody's complaining about, I'm scared of this touchscreen. I think it's going to be a heck of a thing to try to hit the screen while I'm bouncing around in flight. So they made theirs so that they had a touchscreen, but they also had a lot of buttons on the outside that could double up. And they tried to meet those objections. What I've found is that even though they're both great companies, build equally great radios, it's kind of like a Android versus Apple, or a PC versus Mac, or Chevy versus Ford, you name it. People get used to the interface of one or the other, and they either love them or hate them. The people that I know that use the competition, like the Avionics radios or the Aspen glass screens, they love them. They work great. They're dependable. They're reliable. And you know, if the ANP slid it in and it didn't cost them any labor, that might have been what that gentleman was looking for. I have found that because none of those other companies build a full line of products, there's always a compromise to be anti-800-pound gorilla. You know, I wish I didn't have to stand up here and say that they deserve everybody's money, but their equipment does for that reason. The other equipment works really well, and I have nothing bad to say about any of the vendors. Avionics has been a pretty good market for customer service and for reliability. But once they're in and once they're working, they rarely have issues, and they have good warranties on when they do. So, yeah. Oh, what else can I tell you? Yes, sir.
The pedostatic check, what's the currency on that?
So the IFR one, the pedostatic one, we do
just VFR.
$290. Yeah, VFR we do $100.
No, how often do you have to do it?
Currency. I'm sorry. Every 2 years.
Every
24 calendar months. Yep.
Okay.
So a lot of times, like annual, people will ride that out and get an extra month every couple of years. Or, I hate to say it, but the vast majority of my customers forget that theirs was due. That's one avenue I'm hoping to work on quite a bit with this young lady in the middle of the room here. Is part of my new addition to my department. She's got a great background and knows software, knows marketing, and we're hoping to put together more of a spreadsheet where I might be able to send out some emails and say, hey, you know, your IFR check is due in a couple months. You know, is it something you want? I mean, if you think about it, you can't even get out of the dang dentist office without them trying to make your next appointment,
That's right.
And I used to think that was pushy, but I feel a lot worse. I feel a lot worse when somebody calls me and says, yeah, mine expired last year, can you get me in today? It's like, gosh, you know, we did your last one. I really wish we had a way to, to have a little reminder come up on my calendar that would say, you know, hey, this isn't always people's first priority. They've got lives and jobs and other things going on. They might have forgotten about this check, especially since it's not every year.
It's 24
You know,
months, yeah.
some people will align it with their annual, and that's fine. It's a little bit easier maybe to remember, but maybe it wasn't convenient, or maybe it got overlooked. And I do my best to try to sneak those in. They never go well when you try to cram it in the schedule. It's always the airplane that's got bad equipment or a bunch of leaks. But generally, if you know that we're busy, and you were talking about a radio with me last month, and I said it was going to be a few months before we could get to it, I leave a little bit of time for the pedostatic checks in our schedule and for repairs. Being that we're a smaller shop and we've only got a couple of guys, you know, a lot of people will come in. I had a gentleman the other day stopped in, he says, well, no one's working on my airplane. Well, you're right, they've been working on it for 7 hours today, but they went to go do a quick pedostatic check, and they'll be right back on it. So we generally work 10-hour days, and I try to devote 7 or 8 hours to each one of the bigger installs and leave a couple hours for the other customer service issues, so that way I can get them in and get them done. So
So are you currently fully staffed with avionics techs?
well, I can always use more, but right now, because of COVID and everything else that's going on, it has been a very, very tricky year to plan. I don't think sales have really slowed down much as far as the industry goes. I think people still want to fly. Some fly more than ever because they were able to work from home more. But as long as somebody hasn't been financially hit where they had to get rid of it, everybody's still going strong, which is good. My issue was last summer we had a couple technicians that had some family members that were really high risk, and so they were legally able to stay home for an indefinite amount of time and chose to. Most of them have moved on. My core couple of guys that have been lifers at St. Cloud are still working like mad, and so it gave me a chance to get a little more caught up, and we're no longer booked out 6-8 months for an appointment. You know, generally I can get something in within a couple months now, which is nice. So we're busy as can be. We could probably eventually add another full-time technician if we get to that point. But I'd like to get the administrative side tuned up a little, like we talked about with Kelsey, and get things going. So.
And the last question, the 406 ELT, you said, what is that? So it's labor and install. What is that about?
Most airplanes, I want to say it's probably with the equipment and the labor, 1,500 to 2,000, somewhere in there. The nice part about the new ones is they have a GPS interface built in, so if the airplane has, I don't want to say any type of GPS, but almost any GPS that was built in the last 20-25 years. You know, very early ones, the old just textual ones from Apollo and Garmin and King, probably not. But anything with a moving map, you can hook it up to the ELT. And I'll tell you a funny line from the ELT salesman. You know how, again, sales guys, right? They call them sales reptiles for a reason. He basically told me, yeah, the only thing worse than crashing an airplane and dying is crashing an airplane and then dying because no one can find you. Okay, I see that. Well, probably not a big deal in a lot of areas. We hear all these fancy stories about Moonies running out of gas and landing themselves, and when the pilot was passed out because it was perfectly trimmed, and you know, every once in a while all the stars align and the man upstairs is looking out for you, but the vast majority of them end up in a tree or whatever the case is. And if it's not, you know, if I don't have somebody coming looking for me, maybe it's the grizzly, I don't know. So these new ELTs, the old ones, they used to say that they would have about a 20-mile radius. The new 406 ones are satellite based, so they have about a 2-mile radius. If you hook them up to any of the more modern GPSs, they have a 200-foot radius, and it's literally 1 wire extra. So if the equipment's there, I'm going to hook it up. Like I mentioned, and part of the labor is because not only has the new antenna and the new device, but it has a switch on the panel, so we got wires coming all the way up front that we didn't have with the old models.
Is that panel switch required?
It is. Yep, part of the approval. They are not approving those. You know, they went through a mandate time with those, just like ADSB, where it was going to be a mandate and then they dropped it. But like I mentioned, they don't monitor the old ones. So.
Hey Steve, how often when you pick up an ELT are you not right over at the airport?
Pretty much.
Yeah, we
Hangar somewhere.
we get a call every once in a while, and they'll say, "Hey, go into the other hangar about 300 feet to the northwest and go turn off that ELT that's going off." And the accuracy is pretty crazy on it, but compared to the old stuff. The new ones also, most of them have a lithium battery that's like a 5 or 6 year battery too. So I know that's another thing that comes up a lot at annuals is people are replacing batteries in some of the old ones and that. And sometimes they're not available or the ELT doesn't pass the old football toss and the G switch is busted and so, but primarily most of them that I've done recently have been because of radio interference. So not something I like, but again, if it's one more piece of ancient stuff I can take out and replace, I'll try to make it so it doesn't hurt so bad and we'll get it replaced. So,
Speaking of the old ones, I have the old one, of course, and then I have to replace it every 2 years, right?
sure.
Don't they make a battery that can last longer for those things?
They don't because of the approval. So what ends up happening is that manufacturer approved it that way, and it's not cost effective for them to reinvent and sell you a new battery that would last longer. Otherwise, they certainly could, but they choose not to.
Yes.
And
Obviously, anyways, basically.
yeah, when they first did 406s, they were multiple thousands of dollars, and then that GPS interface was a separate box for thousands more. Now that the whole package is $500-600, it's kind of a no-brainer. And a lot of that happens with avionics. There's a great reason where we could easily upgrade the old stuff, and the marketing department at these companies drives the product just as much, if not more, than the engineering. You know, if you've got an airplane that's a little bit obscure, and you've got a whole bunch of buddies that've got the same one, and you want to get Garmin to approve a box, they're going to go and they're going to take a serious look at it. But if they don't see the numbers for sales, it's not going to interest them. So it's unfortunate, but it's true. What else did I miss? Static, ESP. Anybody else? Any questions? I'm over there generally from 8 to 5. Sometimes you'll see us there later. Some people like to come in at 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. I usually try to lock the doors and hide in the corner if I'm there that late doing paperwork. I'm trying to get quotes done for you, but my door is always open. So any questions about it? You know, I do a lot of expensive fancy stuff, but I also do a lot of basic repairs and $50 intercoms and everything else under the sun. We don't discriminate. So anybody that has any compatibility questions or interest in anything, and we generally have a little glass cabinet full of some used stuff in the shop too. That's always a common place to come in and look, and there'll be a lot of equipment in there, everything from instruments to 430 WASs and old Narco and King radios. A lot of times if I think that they're worth something, and somebody's doing a fairly large install, I'll give them a fair offer on trade. If I have a bunch of them and I don't think I can move it, I might not be able to, so it's not a promise, but I try. The more I can offer for somebody, a lot of us are busy and we might be able to get another $100 on eBay, but we really don't want to deal with the hassle. If Chad can give you a little bit less, I don't have to make a ton of money on it. I just have to make it worthwhile for putting it in the cabinet and keeping the lights on and going from there.
Trickle down avionics.
Yeah.
Hey Chad,
Yes.
are the 250 XLs, can you still upgrade those software?
I probably, if there's newer software, yes, and databases, yes. They recently added all of the XL stuff to the list of not repairable, so as long as it works, you're good. Once they had those were really good radios. The only time they usually ever failed is that sometimes the displays would go out, and so if they ever die on you, you're done. But otherwise, if they work, we can usually do the updates. Some of them have batteries in them too. You probably noticed that in your car, it's got a hotline that runs the clock and keeps everything, all your presets or your radios up. Avionics, when you kill the master, it's dead. There's no power to anything in the airplane. Some of the old airplanes might have had a clock that was wired hot, and most people would end up switching that because they wouldn't fly for a month. That would kill their battery. All the avionics generally have some sort of memory battery inside, whether it's a little coin cell like a watch, or it might even be a little bigger, like cutting a AAA battery in half. For instance, the 430s and anything newer than that has it soldered right on the circuit board. So every about 5 or 10 years, you'll get an error message that it's going bad, and what'll happen is it'll forget where it was at. There's nothing worse than turning on your GPS and waiting about a half an hour to figure out it's in St. Cloud. It might even boot up in Europe or something, and when you first turn it on. But once the battery's replaced, it's right back to working great. So they recently came out with some new radios for those. The 250 and a lot of the other smaller 2-inch ones like the King GPSs. Garmin has always been known as being expensive, and everybody else, all their used stuff was kind of down here in the middle, and we really needed something in the middle. they came out with a couple of really cool new little 2-inch GPSs. They have a GPS only, they have one with a comm in it, which is pretty common. And then of course that 375 has the ADS-B transponder built in with the GPS. So those just came out last year and they've been pretty popular too. They're kind of finally a middle grade. They're, you can tell the marketing departments try to capitalize on every target market, not just the guys that have deep pockets, but trying to get everybody into some newer stuff that's safe and more compatible. So. We've got a few of them in our airplanes too. If anybody ever comes over and rents one of the airplanes from the flight school over there, we've got some new ADS-B solutions in them and some new GPSs and whatnot. So come check them out. I'm always willing to demo anything. I've got lots of brochures and stuff over there that you guys, anytime you want to come over and demo the stuff, we could usually find an airplane that we're working on or one that we've already done. We can turn them on, fire them up, and give you a quick little demo. A lot of the Garmin stuff too, you can go on to the Apple Play Store or the Google Play Store and download demo simulators. Since all these radios are touch screens nowadays, you can bring up a brand new like 750 GPS and running it on the app is almost identical to running it in a plane. Unfortunately, it's usually a little smaller. The real one is pretty nice and big, but all the icons and all the features you can put in a heading and airspeed and fly it around the country and put in the airports and everything and set it all up, and it's really a lot like using the real thing. So that's one of the neat parts of some of the new stuff is being able to kind of test it before you buy it, figure out what's going to work for you. So. Well, thank you, everyone. Like I say, if you have anything else,
Thank you.